And yesterday we talked about the tragic split that has occurred in the Western psyche after the lunar age. I think we should go back into that and talk a little bit more in detail about the split that occurred and how it affected our civilization and our psyches.
Okay, well, I think that the first thing is to say that the lunar era held the image of light and darkness together. It didn't split light from darkness. Because the moon gave the image of totality, as well as the phases, that's the individual phases, it held the whole thing together. It held the whole of life in one unified form, as it were. When you come to the solar era, we have, first of all, the split due to the drawing away of the conscious mind increasingly from instinct, from the matrix of instinct. So that's the sort of the ground, as it were, of the whole split. Then we have the manifestations of the split in the idea that light and darkness were opposed to each other, that light and darkness were in enmity and were fighting each other. There was a great cosmic battle between light and darkness. So this entered in all the mythologies of the solar age, and whether we look particularly in the Middle East, that was the main fulcrum, if you like, or the matrix of where this ideology came from. So we lost the older lunar vision of containing the light and the darkness in the whole, as it were.
And all oppositions were contained.
And all oppositions were contained in that. And we moved into the solar era, where you had the polarization of the opposites, and you had the battle, the cosmic battle, as I said, between good and evil. Of course, good was associated with the light and evil with the darkness. And so you have everything to do with darkness being repudiated and everything to do with light being exalted. And you have the whole spiritual emphasis on moving up to the light and away from the darkness, which was utterly different from the shamanic understanding of going into the darkness.
Yes.
And I would like perhaps to come back to Pomenitis in a few minutes, because he was the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who held the two together still before the split, which came with Plato.
And that was actually 500 years before Christ.
Exactly, yes. It was in the 6th century BC.
But he could still hold it together.
But he could hold it. But first I think we should go into the mythologies, which in the Middle East, which perpetuated or formed this split in the human soul at that time and made a huge impact on it, because everybody listened to these stories in the oral form. You had storytellers in every marketplace telling the great epics. And one of the great epics was the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that goes back to 3000 BC, although it was not written down until later. But in that story, a fascinating story, very moving story, Gilgamesh sets out to find the herb of immortality. But first he goes on a great adventure with his companion Enkidu, and they set out to kill Humbaba, who was the guardian of the forests of the goddess in the Lebanon. So there you have it, right at the very beginning.
Right. And I also was astonished to discover that his face often appears in the image of the labyrinth, which is the guide into the depth of darkness.
Yes, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that. Anyway, poor Humbaba got killed, and he begged for mercy, but the two men showed him no mercy. And the goddess, quite rightly, was absolutely furious, and Enkidu died shortly afterwards for possibly infringing this law. They cut down the forest too. They cut down the forest of the goddess.
And she, the goddess, would have been at the center of that labyrinth as the goal of the darkness.
She would have been in the earlier period, yes. So this is a new mythology coming in. And from that, by the way, Gilgamesh found the herb of immortality, but he lost it. And guess who took it away from him? A serpent. A serpent came up out of the water and took it down into the water, and while he was lying asleep by the side of it. And so he lost his herb of immortality.
And in fact, he hadn't really earned it, had he? Yesterday you talked about the relationship between the serpent and the goddess and that divine energy. So it would be quite appropriate that he would have lost it.
Yes. Anyway, that's briefly the story of Gilgamesh, although there's a lot more to it. And he was compared to the moon and the sun, interestingly enough. And then we come to the great Babylonian epic, the epic of the Enuma Elish. And there, as I said yesterday, there you have the split very clearly, where the Marduk kills the old goddess, because she was an ancient sort of figure of a goddess, and splits her body in half. And so there you have the split, literally. He cut her body in half and he made heaven from one half and earth from the other.
Was she a serpent form?
Yes, I think she was shown in serpent form in the tablets sometimes. So perhaps she was a great, goes back to Namu, a Sumerian goddess who was goddess of the deep. That may have been associated with her too. But in any case, that was the end of Tiamat, and humanity was made from the blood of Tiamat's murdered son. So there you have murder and violence coming in addition to the myth of Gilgamesh, which is the first murder, so to speak, of the monster. You have this image of splitting, of violence, of conflict, and so on and so forth. And this goes down next to the Greek mythology, where you have Apollo killing the she-dragon at Delphi. And you have, again, Apollo, the god of light, who really is almost like the chief of the gods apart from Zeus. And you have Hades, one of the brothers of Zeus, who is the ruler of the underworld. And it's not exactly split there, but you have the sea was another brother of Zeus, was ruled by Poseidon. So you have three brothers ruling sky, earth, and underworld, which formerly were all the domain of the goddess in the older culture. Sky, earth, and underworld were all part of her being.
Of her wholeness.
Of her wholeness. So now you have three male images ruling over each part, so to speak. Everything is fragmenting, beginning to split. And all in Greek mythology, the aspects of the goddess in the former mythology now become goddesses in their own right, but they're daughters of Zeus. They're not great goddesses, apart from Gaia.
The spouse who's under his control in many ways.
Exactly, and Hera, his spouse, was under control. And then Persephone was daughter through Demeter, and Artemis and Athene were daughters. So it's quite a different mythology, and the male archetype is supreme there, and the feminine archetype is beginning to be downgraded.
Although Hera certainly fights with Zeus and tries to hold her own.
She tries to hold her own, but Hera in the older mythology was the great goddess,
yes.
And she ruled over the whole plain of where my plain, the Achaean plain, can't remember the exact name of it. Anyway, there were great temples, 3 great temples at least erected to her, and every moonlight night there would be great processions to worship at his temple, not with sacrifices of animals, but with gifts of flowers and things like that.
This is so sad to see her so degraded.
And she's degraded in the Iliad, yes.
Yes, so degraded and arguing and fighting, and here she was the great goddess of the unity of all life, of the cosmos.
Originally she was that, yes.
And then now we see her in Greek mythology in this very degraded form.
Yes, and she's shown in the Iliad, which what comes up then at this time is a warrior ethos. And that warrior ethos has ruled right up to the present time. It's the warrior who is admired, it's victory which has to be gained, defeat is a terrible humiliation. There again, the light and darkness comes in. Victory is the light. Failure to win is defeat and darkness.
It's just like doctors today talk about death as a failure. I mean, everything is seen as a battle between light and dark.
Exactly. It enters into our whole way of thinking. This is what's formed our way of thinking. And this is what I hope in another session we'll be able to talk about, the healing of this great split. I think I should have said that Persian mythology had a huge influence on this whole area in the Middle East. And it was Persian mythology that saw the great battle, the cosmic battle between light and darkness. And it was this that really filtered through, I think, into the Greek mythology and made a huge impact on it and still influences us today. So you have very powerful teachings which were presented as divine truth at that time. So the polarization entered into the teaching of the religions of that time. But I think, and there again, one can find this, if you go to the Iliad and the Odyssey, you find the emphasis on because of the cosmic battle, there was the emphasis of the warrior. The warrior had to fight the enemy as the personification of darkness and evil. So in the Iliad you have really a warrior ethos which was admired for many, many centuries, right up practically to the present day. And people missed the presence in the Iliad of the fact that the suffering that was created, the suffering of women, was all in there, but nobody paid any attention to it because it didn't matter compared to the victory, the great ethos of victory and winning.
And Homer,
the suffering didn't matter.
Didn't matter, and Homer certainly shows the Achaean Greek as being egotistical and undeveloped.
Yes,
in
and
that
pig-headed.
Really. Very, very
pig-headed. And
pig-headed.
Agamemnon didn't listen to the dreams that he was given, warning him not to go to Troy. He went right ahead because he wanted to be the warrior, the great leader. And he came, as we know, to a sticky end with Clytemnestra. Anyway, what happened also, but we find in the Odyssey, we find a much softer story, although it has a fearful battle at the end when all the suitors are wiped out and bloodily dispatched. But you have the quest, really, the idea of the quest coming in of Odysseus wanting to find his way back to Penelope, his wife, to the feminine, who all this time is holding the image of the feminine during the whole book.
And nature.
And weaving and unweaving. She really personifies the goddess, weaving and weaving the cloth which extends her ability to resist the suitors.
And the moon, it could be symbolizing the moon,
exactly,
could be weaving and unweaving.
Yes.
And in every place that Odysseus goes, he confronts the feminine and nature. He must deal with both aspects, which have been split.
He deals with in different feminine figures. He goes through this whole initiation process, which leads him back. He's always guided by the goddess Athena in the first place.
Yes.
And she leads him back to his wife. And then there's a wonderful image of their marital bed. And that bed actually comes down from a Sumerian story of the hulupu tree that was carved into a marital bed, I think, for the hero, I think for Gilgamesh. Anyway, this image of the marital bed carries the image of union between the two aspects, the sacred marriage, and Odysseus and Penelope are really personify that, trying to reunite what has been split apart. Yeah.
And in the battle at the end, the only thing I've ever been able to find that was somewhat healing was that at least Odysseus was not egotistical, because he said that it gave him no pleasure. So it wasn't held up as something ideal to kill in that way. He did it.
He did it,
but
yes.
He gave him no pleasure, and I suppose we're to think that that's a step forward in consciousness.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was really, because I think that he was pretty ruthless and really still in that warrior ideal.
So do you think it was the coming to bed of the sacred marriage was simply that that's the way it seemed necessary to end the epic, because the old lunar mythology was still present?
Possibly, but already in the unconscious. It was not conscious, I don't think. It had gone by then.
And yet he brings it in.
And yet the union is certainly there, and the quest is there, which this is where the quest begins for the lost element, for what's been lost. So you have it's the feminine that's been lost. So in that Odyssey, you do have the enactment, really, of the quest to rediscover, or to discover, or reunite with what's been lost. And that goes through a lot of Greek mythology. It goes through the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur, and the thread of Ariadne that guides him into and out of the labyrinth. But then he goes and deserts her when he gets out. He leaves her and goes off with someone else.
Didn't learn a great deal.
So he hasn't really integrated the feminine in his soul. But now I think we ought to really go back to the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Pomenides, because Pomenides still belonged to the shamanic lunar culture. And in his journey, we have only a few fragments, but he made this shamanic journey into the underworld of the goddess Persephone. Persephone isn't actually named, she's called the goddess. And there he speaks to her, and she tells him, beware of the mortals who really know nothing, she says. And she tells him to take back the wisdom that she's teaching him to the world of mortals, and to establish it as a good way of living. So there's the journey into the underworld. The underworld is not terrifying at that time. They have to go into a state of incubation shamanic state of incubation to enter it, but this was part of the practice of becoming a healer.
So this is really where we see the darkness and the feminine as a regaining of that part of the lunar mythology that has been lost.
Well, that hadn't been lost at that stage.
In
With Parmenides,
500
it hadn't been lost.
No, I mean, but
not totally, at least not with the philosophy of Parmenides.
But I mean, it was
In the culture.
in the culture.
Yeah.
So we see that Parmenides is really carrying forth this lunar
Yes,
wholeness.
he's carrying it forward. And also he came from a line of shamanic healers and passed on his wisdom to a line of shamanic healers. We know for 500 years. There's actual proof of that because it's written on stone tablets in a place called Velia in southern Italy. The names of these shaman healers are written down there. But he was one of the teachers of Plato. But you'd never know that from reading Plato. Plato barely mentions him. And with Plato, you get the split between the rational mind and the healing soul. The whole heart consciousness and the shamanic consciousness is lost with Plato. And that's where the split comes in Greek philosophy anyway.
And he was so influential in Western
And he was
culture.
tremendously influential, particularly on the Christian theology and on the whole of Western culture, and indeed on Western science. And the proud emphasis on us being rational beings comes straight from Plato. But as I said, there was a great loss there between Parmenides and Plato, which we need to take note of.
And you were talking about Parmenides, who lived around 500 BC. And you were just talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey as reflecting that split, that tragic split that had taken place in that world. And that was at least 500 years before Parmenides.
That's
so
right, yes.
It really shows us that some cultures were so split apart, and there were other groups still holding on to this lunar knowledge and tradition.
Yes, that is very interesting, because the Iliad must have been around, as you say, around 1000 BC, and I think that's a little bit after when the Doric, the Dorian peoples came down into Greece and into Crete as conquerors. So that's the era of really when the old lunar cultures began to be overrun by these very strong warrior influences, and that's shown in the Iliad. But there, as you say, in the Odyssey, there is the movement to try and retain the older thing, or perhaps, we don't know how conscious it was, but the story of the quest is actually the story to recover what was lost. And that's already in the consciousness of the time. And Parmenides, we don't know how, but Parmenides, I think he was around mid-6th century BC, he held this older shamanic teaching, which actually was kept alive, I think, in Anatolia, and it was the pre-Socratic philosophers who came from that western coast of Anatolia, which is modern Turkey.
As did Homer.
As did Homer,
So Homer may
and
well have had
they
that
may
knowledge.
have carried it from there. And in fact, Parmenides' group, as it were chased out of an island off the coast of Anatolia by the Persians, and they were given just one night to pack up all their belongings and set sail. And they did, and they landed first in Corsica, and then they moved on from Corsica to southern Italy. So he brought that tradition, I think, from Anatolia, from what was once ancient.
Yes,
what
it
was
certainly
modern
seems
Turkey.
so. Because now the artifacts have been found in
And
southern
they've
Italy.
been found in southern Italy,
support that.
And then the tradition was carried on through what he taught. But he didn't have sufficient influence on Plato, who was obviously influenced by the tradition coming down from this conquering ethos. Plato's much more into that, and he didn't carry Parmenides' vision through into his writing. And that is a tragedy, I think.
That is a tragedy, because it seems from Peter Kingsley's work, as you were talking about before, that we have in that period of time very, very intense groups of people who were still worshiping the cosmos through the image of the goddess and nature. And it was very, very powerful. Kingsley talks about the many temples to the goddess in Italy. And Yet
Absolutely,
Plato was already reflecting the split, and unfortunately, it was Plato who influenced our culture.
Yes, rather than Parmenides.
Parmenides.
Because unfortunately Parmenides left so little that
Yes.
people couldn't make a lot of sense of it later, and it really wasn't until Peter Kingsley came along that he really could go into all this and set Parmenides where he should be, which
Absolutely.
is primary figure in
He's given us
Greek
an
philosophy.
incredible gift in that
He
knowledge.
really has, yes. So now I think that we ought to perhaps go on to the different effects of the split.
Well, did you want to just reiterate what you had said about Genesis, that definitely reflects the split as well? You had talked so
Yes.
beautifully about that yesterday.
Yes, well, it's certainly there in the myth of the fall. There it is, plain for all of us to see that there was a loss of this connection with the divine. In Genesis, it's put that being chased out of the Garden of Eden, or being banished from the Garden of Eden. But in fact, the Garden of Eden was nature. It was the old shamanic connection that there was with the cosmos, with nature, which was there in Palestine, actually, when the Hebrews came in to Palestine, and which then was unfortunately repressed. Perhaps it was decadent by then. It's true to say it had become decadent, so possibly there were reasons for the repression. But at the same time, so much was thrown out, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater.
It's interesting and that
and
myth
that's
so
sad.
does reflect that nature was present, but that we exiled ourselves from nature by allowing the split to take place in our psyche.
Well, we couldn't stop it really, because it was something that happened through the mythologies of that time and the influence of those mythologies. They made the split between the conscious ego and the deep matrix of consciousness wider and wider and wider as we went on through the solar era, or the patriarchal era. And you can say it's a tragedy, but it happened, and now we have to work to know how to heal that split.
Well, in that sense, it might be a real tragedy, is that something tragic happens, but that we become more conscious or better as a result of that act in the ancient tradition of tragedy, hopefully.
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 We learn something,
Yeah.
and all ends well.
That
As Julian of Norwich said, all shall be well in the end.
But, so the Garden of Eden, then, we don't want to say that we caused it so much, because we were really
We were the
victims of what was
mythologies.
taking place. And the mythology reflected, though, what was taking place, didn't it?
Exactly.
But it's an
yes.
interesting thing that you've said, that the garden is certainly nature, and we are exiled from it. We did indeed exile ourselves from it as we became more conscious. But maybe you could talk a little, did we really go into that well enough yesterday about eating the fruit, the apple of consciousness, and bringing about our exile? As
Yes, one could see that myth as a myth of the birth of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's much more healing to see it in that way, rather than as something that's sinful or evil or anything. It is certainly, it portrays the loneliness, it portrays the choice, the possibility of choice. Yeah, we have responsibility now. In becoming conscious, we take responsibility for our actions, when before we lived in a more unconscious state, apart from people like Pomenitis and the leaders exactly of that time. But probably the rest of the population lived much more unconsciously, much more instinctively. And this myth tells us that we're coming out of instinctive behavior, purely instinctive behavior, and we're looking at our actions. We have the power of reflection, we have the power of choice because of that. And it's taken us all this time really to reach the point where we can return to what we've lost, but without falling back into total unconsciousness.
Well, then we could say, instead of blaming the Hebrews for giving us such a dreadful myth that has caused us so much pain and sorrow, we could say, looking at it from another perspective, that the myth is really reflecting our eating from the tree of consciousness, the apple of consciousness,
exactly.
and that made us aware of our physical bodies and sexuality, and that we felt negative about it. We didn't quite know yet how to deal with it once we became conscious.
Well, it was very powerful. So instead of acting purely instinctivhawk, say like the sparrowhawk who falls on the blackbird, we have a choice of whether to act in a certain way. So it did, and it was Eve, it was the woman who took the apple in the first place at the guidance of the serpent. So the serpent actually is a guide. in that myth, looking at it from a different perspective.
Yes, and that the
and
divine
then Eve
wants
responds
us.
to that guidance, takes the apple, gives it to Adam, and initiates this whole new phase of consciousness.
Exactly. It's just as in the fairy tale that anytime people are told, don't do that. Do you see that room? Do not go into that room while I'm gone. And exactly, of course, the person is going to do it. So
Yes.
God's having said to Adam and Eve, do not eat of this tree, could mean certainly that he definitely
yes,
wanted them to eat of that tree of consciousness. That
And the
was
serpent
natural.
was the agent of that, and the serpent would have been the voice of the goddess in the older cultures. Here it's given a different emphasis, and you have the difference between God and the serpent, so to speak, and paradise as a state we have to leave. But I think that it's very important to know we can look at things from a different perspective, definitely. And we don't have to see it all as doom and gloom. It is actually a tremendous new phase in our evolution. And we've gone slightly wrong because the split was so pronounced, and that the sense of guilt was so pronounced that we took the guilt out in the form of violence and aggression against other people.
And the repression, yes, of sexuality.
And the repression of sexuality led to aggression, much more aggression than there would have been normally, I think. Speaking as a psychotherapist, I would say that. So what was split off and repressed in ourselves became projected out onto others as something to be attacked. Is that?
Yes, I think that yesterday we talked so much about how dreadful that myth has been for us, that by the woman being blamed and eating of the fruit, being blamed and condemned, that this particular act was then the core of all evil. We are born with that evil.
Yes, we're born with the contamination.
Contamination is the right word. So that, and that is a very true way of looking at it, but there's also this way.
Yeah, but that was a misinterpretation, if you like, of the myth, or an interpretation,
Definitely.
which led to very negative imprinting. But if one can see it in this other way, one can perhaps resolve that negative imprinting, let it go and dissolve it.
And just see it as the myth of becoming conscious rather than the sin that Eve committed, and therefore we are all contaminated from her. Yes, that was an interpretation, and I think in a sense we can say, well, too bad that the Hebrews looked at it in that way, because it was a will to control in that interpretation of it.
I think there was, and that was passed on, unfortunately passed on to Christianity, which became much more pronounced than it was, I think, in Judaic culture. In Christianity it was given huge emphasis because Christianity made the sacrificial death of Christ as the compensation as the redemption of that initial sin. So it was a building block. It was the foundation stone of Christian theology. You wouldn't have needed the sacrificial death of the Son of God if you hadn't had the sin of Adam and Eve. That's very important to get that clear, because therefore it's very difficult for Christianity to let go of that myth, because it is the primary building block for the need for the sacrificial death of God. The Son of God.
And had he not died, what would we have needed in that place for our wholeness?
Well, I think we would have needed what we're getting now, which is realization of what we've become split off from, what we've lost, and what we need to reconnect with. And that was really all that was needed. We didn't need a sacrificial death of anyone, or Son of God, or anyone else. But we do need a sacrifice of certain beliefs that we've held, which have led us into the position where we now have a one-eyed consciousness which is ruling the world, when we really need to have, we carry within us, as it were, two ways of knowing. One is this more ancient lunar shamanic way of knowing, the other is the solar way of knowing, and we need to bring these two together, heal our psyche, and reconnect with the earth and with the cosmos. And that would accomplish our redemption. We don't need any Son of God to sacrifice for us. I really feel that very, very strongly.
Well, I certainly do too, and I think, and I would like to ask you about this, the death of the Son in earlier mythology would simply have been that we as human beings are born into time and space, and that we must live our lives and then die. So we do die, or the son of the great mother, or the daughter of the great mother. We must all die, but we are reborn, and it's not seen as a sacrifice, certainly not for anybody's wrongdoing.
No, because really, we'll come to this perhaps later on, but there was no separation between life and death.
No.
Everything was a continuous cycle. There was only one life, really.
Yes, so
and death was a phase.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It was just a phase.
Not
but
a
then
sacrifice.
As you said, we would be reborn. So there is, the sacrificial idea comes originally from the dark phase of the moon. The moon goes into the darkness and is reborn. And that gave rise to the idea that perhaps there was a necessity for sacrifice to bring back the crescent moon. But this entered in later on to the idea of that we needed the sacrifice of the Son of God in order to regenerate us.
Yes, oh, that's
it's
beautiful.
So deep, this.
Yeah.
It's so deep.
It is, but that's a beautiful way of putting it. And it's interesting to look at these myths as structures which reveal nature and our nature and nature of the cosmos, and how so often we misinterpret them and cause ourselves great harm as a result of it.
Well, we interpret them too literally, and we think that something has to be fixed and final. Because it was fixed and final in the past, it has to remain that way in the future. So we get stuck or fixated really in beliefs that do us great harm.
And stop our growth.
And stop our growth, and that's what I call the hedge of thorns. These are the beliefs that act as a hedge of thorns from our rescuing this soul element in ourselves, bringing it to life again, giving it the kiss which will awaken it to life.
Oh, and that's so beautiful. But so many students who study mythology have the idea that the feminine, and we touched on this just a little bit yesterday, as both mother and consort, that in prehistory the woman was the mother and then had sexual relationships with her son. Now, if indeed that ever did occur, it would simply be another one of those misinterpretations of the different aspects of the feminine relationship to the masculine, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's attempting to interpret mythology and apply it to social situations literally. That's what I mean by literalism.
Yes.
And that's a big mistake. I'm quite sure that didn't happen. And that's why perhaps a taboo grew up in Christian or whatever. There are certain taboos of incest. But I think that would have applied equally in earlier times. And it was mythologically acted out, but that didn't mean to say that every mother slept with her son. No. It's ridiculous.
No. And even if it did happen, we can't say that is the archetype. The archetype is reflecting the different relationships of feminine and masculine, it would seem to me.
Yeah, exactly. The archetype is separate from the human...
social acting out of it.
Yeah, the human situation, really.
And that's one thing that's so important that you're pointing out, I think, is that our misunderstanding of the phases of our growth and development has really brought us much harm, just as in misunderstanding eating of the tree of a consciousness that Eve brought us such condemnation and rejection. And
I think I wouldn't have understood what I do now if I hadn't if I hadn't been taken into the field of Jungian psychology, because I had to understand the psyche. I had to understand where the psyche where the conscious mind originated, that it didn't just spring like Athena from the head of Zeus, that actually had to evolve out of the matrix of nature very, very slowly over millions of years. And we only know the latest phase of it, so to speak, in these mythologies that describe it. But if I hadn't known that, I wouldn't have the depth that has been given to me, really, to understand history and theology in a different way, and to see the importance of bringing the psyche into everything so that we can free ourselves from being condemned to reenact these patterns which belong to our mythology, but which don't have to be lived out forever and ever. We don't have to sacrifice young human lives in war forever and ever, because we're still gripped by this solar mythology of victory and defeat, or enemies out there we have to defeat.
Well, this really shows us once again how valuable Jung has been, and continues to be to our understanding of our psyche and of history and of his theology. It's so important.
It's so important, and he did a fantastic work. I just don't know how he accomplished so much in one human life, but he really understood so much through his own experience, and he was a shaman, and there's no question about it. And because of that, he recovered the old shamanic consciousness by his own personal experience, and then gave it out to the world in a form that the world, for the most part, has not been able to understand, but it's there for people who
Yes.
are able to get to the, to
Yes.
the root of it. It's there available for them, and for me, I think it's the greatest blessing of my life that I found my way
it was
to it.
absolutely in
Yeah.
mine too. And is that not what he's talking about when he talks about the dangers of identifying with the archetype, is that then we might try to live it out literally in life rather than understanding it
Yes.
as a larger dimension of soul.
Absolutely.
And
And
psyche.
the big danger today is in leaders who identify unconsciously with the archetype of the hero who's going to defeat the dragon of evil. So they identify with the solar hero, and they're becoming the leaders of these great armies which are going to defeat the enemies of darkness. And we can see it so in the Bush doctrine, absolutely, in the way he was thinking, the way he was programmed to think. He was identified, and so was Tony Blair in England, with the archetype of the solar hero. And that led them into an inflation, what the Greeks called hubris. And the Greeks recognized the danger of this 2,500 years ago, and it's in all the plays, the great plays of the Greek
It certainly
tragedians.
is. And I think we don't really realize the danger of that kind of hubris or identifying with the solar hero. We don't really realize what it will ultimately lead to. And I think you were going to talk about that, and if
Yes.
not now, later, about
I think we
what
need
this
to-
kind of thinking leads to.
I think I'd like to talk a little bit more about how the split in Christianity led to the idea that there was the orthodox tradition, so to speak, and anybody who was in any way mystical or different, or say worked with healing or was more on the shamanic level,
Or
would
with
be-
herbs.
exactly, would be branded a heretic. And the fate of that between the 13th century and the 18th century, for it went on for a long time, was to be burnt at the stake. And that is sacrifice in the old lunar idea of the sacrifice of the moon and going into darkness, but that was the literal enactment of an archetypal image, putting it into the human sphere, that there had to be the light on one side and the dark on the other, and the dark would be got rid of, because then
Rather
there would
than
be only
integrated.
the light. So they were looking to have only the light, only the truth, the one truth, and that enters into all the monotheistic religions. You have one God, one truth, one light, and anything that challenges that or that's different or threatens it is regarded as something that has to be eliminated. And this is so deep. It's within all the conquest of the say the people in America, the great conquests that took place, the Spanish conquistadors. It goes into the whole idea of empire and conquering the dark races, the primitive races. It goes into the repression of the indigenous cultures in America and elsewhere, that they were considered to be inferior, and even teaching things that were of the devil later on, because this comes in, anything that's different is of the devil. This enters into fundamentalist Christianity very strongly. And you also had the split between heaven and hell. Some go to hell, they're the damned, and the saved go to heaven. This goes right the way through Christian theology from St. Augustine onwards, and it very much in the Middle Ages, with the terrible depictions of hell where people would be sent to. People lived in real terror of being of hellfire and being sent to hell. And of course, as soon as possible, they found other people, not themselves,
Yes, we could.
who could be eliminated and who could be sent to hell, and burning them at the stake was believed to be a method of saving them from hell, if you please, putting them through the hell of that.
So
I mean, it's just unbelievable.
it's an insanity.
But it enters into our weapons, our nuclear weapons, and our sale of arms. All that whole scenario comes straight from this mythology.
From
I think
identifying with the solar hero,
Exactly.
a win-lose
And
mentality.
we then develop the weapons which are going to make us invincible, which will guarantee victory even in outer space. It's a most demonic mythology when it's used in that sense.
And it's used in that sense by thousands and thousands of people today, probably because it fills that empty space of longing for their own inner development, don't you think?
I think it's projected onto this great battle, and also it fills them with a sense of elation that they have the truth and that other people haven't got the truth.
Yes.
They are the elect.
Yes,
And
and
that-
just that idea is so strange.
It's
isn't it?
terrible,
The
and that
elect.
enters into evangelical Christianity, because if you think of yourself as having the teaching, the great truth that you're going to impart to the whole of humanity, that's a huge inflation, and Christianity fell into that.
Tremendous inflation.
Yeah, tremendous inflation of thinking that it was the best religion.
But it's inevitable that there will be an inflation if there is a split. The split and inflation go together, don't they?
They do, yes.
Is that because we're going to identify ourselves with the light.
With the light, inevitably. Who wants to be identified with the darkness when the darkness is said to be evil and satanic even?
And so that ultimately can lead nowhere else but to self-destruction. Or planetary destruction.
Planetary destruction, ultimately, if we don't wake up and see what we're caught up in. Because it's really like a dream. We've been living a dream for all these thousands of years, and we need to realize that we are extraordinary beings. We have the power of insight now. We have the ability to look at all this and understand it, which is a tremendous evolutionary attainment.